Hi everyone, and welcome to my presentation on the competencies of professional psychology rating scales. My name's Kylie Rice and I'm a lecturer in clinical psychology at the University of New England. Let's commence quickly by reviewing some of the key background information that relates to the measure. And I do talk quickly, so I apologise. However, in this context, it may be an advantage because we only have a few minutes together. So as you will all well and truly know, the APAC Standards released in 2019 introduced considerable change, in particular in the professional programs. So level 1, the foundational competencies, now refers to the undergrad 3-year sequence in psychology. Level 2, the pre-professional competencies, is the 4th year honours. And then we come to level 3, which is your professional competencies level. And that's your 5th year qualification or 5th year program of study. And level 3 encompasses the expected standards at the professional level for general registration. Then there's level 4, which is your professional competencies for specialised areas of practice, which build on level 3 competencies. And that's your endorsement level at 6th year, such as counselling psychology, health psychology, clinical, etc. So overall, the standards now apply a competency-based model of professional training. And it's a bit of a transition from more of a tasks achieved approach towards measuring competence across multiple domains of practice. Now, an implication and challenge of this competency-based model is the measurement of competence. So competence refers to the professional skills across numerous domains, for example, assessment or intervention or ethics, etc. Whereas competency is used to refer to the particular skills that sit within these domains, according to Stevens et al. So previously there hasn't been a consensus in Australia over the required competencies of practice. However, thankfully, the APAC standards have now helpfully identified the core skills at each level. So training providers of accredited programs of study are obligated to ensure that graduates adequately develop these competencies that are specified in the standards at these levels. So this helps to move the debate beyond the necessary competencies and what are these competencies at each level, and then leads us to the challenge of assessing these competencies instead. So a measure that can standardise the evaluation of performance of competencies within professional training is needed. Such a measure could help with evaluating performance on placements at level 3 or 5th year. A measure could also be used to evaluate OSCEs, so use standardised rubrics and so on for OSCEs, which are your objective structured clinical examinations. It could be used for unit and course outcome analysis and looking at performance comparisons and program evaluations. And it might also be useful to compare competency development between placement types. So your simulated placements and face-to-face placements versus telehealth placements and so on. So such a measure would also be useful in 5+1 internships, so evaluating performance in that internship component. And it might also be useful in supervision at the registered psychologist level. So assessment of competence is not just limited to student performance and educational institutions and professional trainings. We are ethically obliged to be acutely aware of our strengths and competencies in practice as psychologists. And we also need to act within areas of our competence. So we need assessment measures and processes that can help us as psychologists to continually learn throughout our careers. So we need to be able to review and assess our own practice. Otherwise, we run the risk of becoming incompetent, perhaps without even being aware of it. So competence in professional practice is dynamic. It's not static. Competence changes throughout your career. So obtaining and maintaining competence should be a professional objective for all psychologists, and the ongoing assessment of competence is gold standard for the discipline. So a practitioner's ability to self-assess their own competence across multiple domains of practice is essential in order to improve client outcomes, maintain competence, and also identify the need for further training. So measures of competence can assist practitioners to assess their own strengths, their areas for development, and their training needs. So to our knowledge, there is currently no known quantitative measure of multidimensional professional psychology competence that encompasses all of the level 3 APAC standards at registered psychologist level for the Australian context. And that kind of a measure would be very useful for training and practice and research. Hence, that's the background and the rationale for the COPPR scales, or the Competencies of Professional Psychology Rating Scales. So the COPPR has two versions, a self-report version, where psychologists can reflect on their own competence, and there's also an observer report version. So in the observer rated version, this can be used by supervisors in practice, supervisors on placement, by peers, or by other people such as even clients, to rate their perceptions of a psychologist's competence across one or more domains of practice. So the COPPR scales address the need for a multidimensional measure of psychologist competencies at level 3. So the scales were developed from the APAC level 3 standards. That was the starting place. And they were developed through a systematic series of scale development procedures, which were informed by those papers. And this development process is being outlined thoroughly in a paper that's in the process of being published. So watch this space, and please get in touch with me if you'd like a copy of that paper once it is published. It is a Rice et al. And I'm the first author, so you can contact me if you'd like a copy of that when it is published. And the development of the scales included formal stakeholder review and pre-test processes, etc. So the developmental process resulted in 11 domains of practice. Now remember that each of these can be used as an individual subscale for something like an OSCE rubric, or they can be used as an entire scale. So we have scientist practitioner, cultural responsiveness, working across the lifespan, professional communication and liaison skills, clinical interviewing, counselling microskills, formulation and diagnosis, assessment, intervention, ethics, and self-reflective practice. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to go through each of those in great detail, but they're probably quite self-explanatory at this point. In terms of the response format on the measure, we've got a 7-point scale with behavioural anchors. Now, the 7-point scale provides discrimination beyond a rating of competent. So we've attempted to reduce possible halo effects that have been previously noted in other like-it scales by providing additional ratings past competent. This will allow supervisors and practitioners to more accurately discriminate the level of performance on each item. We hope the COPPR scales will have great utility in application and address that gap as an emerging multidimensional measure of psychologist competencies that are based on the APAC Level 3 standards. The self-report and observer report versions will have many benefits. For example, you can compare a supervisee's self-report version with a supervisor's observer-rated version and look at the similarities and differences in the two within supervision. You can also calculate average subscale scores for each domain, which is really useful for tracking change. And individual domains can be used separately or together, or multiple domains, or the entire scale. So as per the initial rationale for the scales, we hope they'll have great application, such as measuring the development of competencies in training. You could use them in OSCEs, rubrics. You could use them to evaluate units and course outcomes and performance. You could use them as placement performance indicators for fifth-year courses and internships. They could be used in supervision, in research, and definitely in self-reflective practice for all registered psychologists. So self-reflection is an essential area of competence for all psychologists at all stages of your career. This is recognised in the APAC Standards now, and research suggests that reflective ability is closely related to the assessment of competence. And recall that I mentioned earlier, measures of competence can assist practitioners to assess their own strengths, areas for development and training needs, and assessing competence can help practitioners with continual learning throughout their career. So by completing the COPPR self-report, psychologists can reflect on their performance over all domains of competence. And from there, they can assess the areas which they need to focus on and make a plan to target those skills. For example, if your score on the intervention domain is lower, you can choose CPD that helps you to build your treatment skills. Or if you've mainly worked with children and your result on the working across the lifespan domain was lower than other domains, you might choose to undertake some supervised practice, working with a broader age group. And you can also see trends in your domains, so you can track your own change over time and hopefully see improvement on the ones that you're trying to target and improve. So hopefully you can see that the COPPR is intended to have utility for practitioners in terms of self-assessment and self-reflective practice of their own competence. So in terms of accessing the COPPR scales, there are several publications in process. We've also commenced data collection to evaluate the psychometric properties of the scales in various settings. And it's intended that these scales will be freely available once they're validated. However, registered psychologists are invited to have a sneak peek at the self-report version of the scale. So here's your invitation to complete the self-report version as a self-reflective exercise. Now, this is for all psychologists at any stage of your career, whether you're provisionally registered, generally registered, if you have an endorsement or not. We invite you to complete the measure and reflect upon the multiple domains of practice of a psychologist. Remember that competence fluctuates throughout your career and that this is a great opportunity to realistically reflect on areas of strength and areas that you could target in CPD, for example. You'll have the opportunity to screenshot your average domain scores at the end of the survey, so you can take that away with you. And all responses are anonymous and confidential, so please do use this as an opportunity to reflect honestly. So here is your official invitation. This has been approved by the Human Research Ethics Committee at our university. So to access that survey, all you do is use the QR code that is on your screen right now, that we're all familiar with these days. And that will continue beyond today, so you can come back and access that another time. And you can do that as a self-reflection activity. So complete the scales, thinking about things you might like to target in CPD and self-reflecting on areas that you might have strength in and areas you might like to develop. You can also, at the end, take a screenshot of the average domain subscale scores, and you can also ask for a certificate of completion that you can include in your CPD records as a self-reflective activity. If you do that, all you do is enter your email at the end, but it pops up in a separate field, so it will not be associated with your responses above. It's totally separate, and it will in no way be linked to your responses. If you've got any questions, or you would like some more information about the scales, or you'd like to use them in research or placements or educational settings, please contact me directly. There's my email address on the screen. And remember that practitioners can go and access the survey now for self-reflection purposes. using that QR code on the screen. Feel free to distribute that QR code amongst your networks and colleagues, etc. as well. But thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for watching this presentation. And if you've got any questions, please feel free to get in touch. Thank you.